Yes. So, what have we meant by failing fast? As we get into this topic on failure and even speed of failure, I want you to know also that I am not context blind. I think I was thinking about some of you that I know, and I've heard your stories around the way that failure looks for you today might look very different than you would if you had thought about it even 2 or 3 years ago. And so I would invite you to bring your context to whatever comments I might make. And if you're new to the WiLD conversation, by the way, my goal is always just to open up thinking, and to give you some of my own thinking, but also to tell you that this is personal for me because I do have a long list of failures, and I'm not just saying that to be like put that out there. Some of which I would share with you, and some of which I probably wouldn't. That I would need to know you better to do that. But I think I want to ask this question out of the gate: is what have we meant by this? We've heard it failing fast, or even failing forward. And we titled this "Failing Fast Gets You Nowhere," which is a little overstated, but I think there's some truth to that because when we look, we're going to talk about the research in just a moment. But it's almost like this: if we don't think about the whole story around failure, we might miss what the whole story is, and it just becomes a statement. For example, like "work hard, play hard" is a catchphrase, or you can be anything you want to be, or just these kinds of things that we throw out there to people. But does that really live into our reality of what it means for us to function as whole people together? And I would say that you'll know this by the end of my comments, that I would say failure is so important. And I realized that when we even titled it this, we talked to one of the CEOs we worked with who thought that we were saying that failure is not important. And that is not at all what that meant. It's more around that concept of let's fail fast, let's fail a lot. But we got to really talk about what is failure? What is that about? So where did this come from? And I think one place it came from is this idea of getting the mistakes out quickly so we can get on to the successes, right? Get the mistakes out quickly so we can get on to the successes. It's a very entrepreneurial idea, this failing fast idea, because it means to try lots of things, to iterate. That's used a lot when you hear people talk about the necessity for failing fast, is this necessity for iterations. It's often associated with the idea of a VUCA world. We live in this volatile, uncertain kind of a world. And so we need people that it's more that way, which I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly things are moving fast. And I think it was also a reaction against, which is typical with statements like this, a reaction against other statements that imply that you will only be hired or succeed in our organization if you're succeeding, that we have no tolerance for failure, both business-wise and personal failure. And it's interesting because the concept of failing fast or failing forward has value, but developmentally is very, very easily misguided into something that misses the point. I think that's the possibility when we think about the whole story. John Maxwell wrote a book about failing forward. It's called Failing Forward. And the idea that if we could rethink failure and realize that it may lead to something good, that failure is a good thing. And his thinking culminates in the idea that we can teach people to move beyond their mistakes and achieve their potential and success. All right, so that's kind of, that book was quite popular. In other ways, the concept of failing fast is usually used as a way to talk about iteration, as I said, over perfection. Here's a quote from Forbes, and I'll read you. In today's complex business environment, where things are changing constantly, speed of execution is a lot more important than perfect execution. This is straight out of Forbes, one author says. While you're trying to perfect a certain solution or product, the situation might have changed already, rendering your product or solution irrelevant. Make it good enough, ship it, improve it based on market feedback, rinse and repeat. This approach attains, again, this is a quote out of Forbes, this approach attains a solution much faster because of the snowball effect of iterative learning. That's the idea that they describe anyway. So that all sounds good. Here's a couple of problems with overstated things like that, all right? One problem is this: failing fast, unless it's held in tension with other things, I would suggest is reckless. Unless it's held in tension, those of you that know me well know that I kind of see the world that way. Like, we got to have a balance for wisdom between different things. Here's an interesting statistic. I don't want to overstate statistics, but do you know that 65 to 95%, like the research is all over the map, but it's pretty high. It's way over 50. 65 to 95% of venture funded startups fail. Like most venture funded startups, they don't make it. The money does nothing. Moving fast and going big doesn't pay off in the end in the vast majority of cases. And I've watched, I don't know about you, but I've watched so many friends who have gotten $1 million in venture funding, and they were like, let's go, move fast. And they hired up their big staff, they got a huge payroll, and they're out of business within 2 years. And it's interesting because venture capitalists are willing to take that risk, right? So I'm not saying that these are entrepreneurs. There's a whole deeper story. I get that. As an entrepreneur myself, I think that's interesting. Here's another problem, is that failing fast is often associated with agility. If you just look it up, you'll see a lot of talk around learning agility and creating more agile kinds of organizations and people. But speed is only one aspect of agility. And it misses, we've talked about this in the past, some of you have been a part of the WiLD conversation, it misses the reality that agility and learning look different for each of us. You cannot be anything or anyone you want to be. If you don't believe me, just watch an American Idol audition. I mean, it's just, I'm not saying you shouldn't aspire to great things, but I'm like, part of it is discovering what we are good at and what we're bad at, that we might get informed by that. The job might be to discover who we are designed and called to be, and that you have different ways that you move, and speed is only one attribute. And the same is true of our organizations, I would suggest. And so here's another possible problem, is that failing fast misses the reality that even business failures, I'm going to describe this more in a moment, are deeply personal. We're talking about failures, deeply personal. So let me go on the more inspiring side. So I love this John Wooden quote. You know, John Wooden quotes are thrown out all the time. The great coach John Wooden, and he said this. He said, "Be quick, but don't hurry. Be quick, but don't hurry." And I love this quote because he understands the tension, as he says this, between quickness and rushing. That there's a tension there between the need to move and fail fast, while maintaining wisdom and thoughtfulness while we fail. Like, that's an interesting tension. He went on to say, you have to know what to do, but you have to be quick to do it, or you might not get to do it at all. And he says, I think that's important in most everything. Don't hurry. You make mistakes when you hurry. Be under control. I want quickness under control. That's what he said. Otherwise, you'll have activity without achievement. And he said, I don't care for activity without achievement. Don't mistake activity for achievement. He says this. So let me I want to just introduce you to the research on failure, which is, there is some incredible stuff that's out there. And we've actually done some of this research. I was involved in a couple of research projects where we were creating developmental maps, experiential maps, where leaders could go in and they could actually click on, this was in the early days of the web. And so you could click on these different experiences on a map that would help you understand. If you clicked on it, it would describe the experience that other leaders in our studies had described, and other people's studies as well, but it would tell you the kinds of things that you would learn from these kinds of developmental experiences. Now, here was the challenge that we faced. Failure is in hardships. Failure, like, I let people down. I made a horrible mistake. I made this mistake in my business and 50 people lost their jobs, and some of them have just bought houses. You know, these are the kinds of things. I know a leader whose business made a mistake, and it was all on his shoulders, and people died. These are real failures that were very complex in terms of what the solutions look like. And so I say that they were deeply, deeply personal, but our challenge was, are we going to include failures on that mapping of experiences that people might look to? It's interesting because if you think about it, were we going to have a clickable part of a map where someone could go, okay, I want to experience a failure? Because these were experiences you didn't want to have. Like, you would like to have avoided. They weren't iterations, they were failures. So let me tell you a little bit more about the research. I'm gonna geek out for a minute, because I have this book that is, this is the technical manual for some original seminal research on the lessons of experience research. Some of you are familiar with this research. It was a really powerful thing, this discovery of the most powerful experiences that changed people's lives. And I can't say it better than they did, so I'm just gonna read to you like it's story time, all right? If I could do this, like this opening statement, and this is called in the book. This is a technical manual, not a book that you want to pick up and read, you know, like in a park someday. But this is what a geek I am. So, all right. So it's called the Introduction to the Hardships. All right. I read this again this morning. Listen to this. There is no question that many of the assignments leaders described were tough, sometimes even traumatic. This is all the research on the developmental experiences related to hardships and failures. But these trials by fire, demanding as they were, ended in the exhilaration of success. Their lessons, too, were those of success, of overcoming the odds of meeting the challenge. But the successful leaders we studied did not have lives of unbroken victories. Like the rest of us, they faced setbacks and outright failures. They blew it on the job, in their personal lives, in their climb up the corporate ladder. We identified 5 kinds of events that we grouped together. We identified them as hardships. And they go through the list of those things. It was like business failures and mistakes, demotions, missed promotions, lousy jobs, breaking a rut, subordinate performance problems, and personal trauma. From the labels we gave them, it's clear that the hardships were a mixed bag. They range from severe personal traumas like death and divorce to events with happy conclusions like the discovery of a new career after the ordeal of giving up the old one. As different as they were from one another, they shared 3 characteristics. Listen to this. This is crazy about failure. This is why I say like failing fast. There's so much more going on in this developmentally. Managers accepted appropriate personal responsibility for the mess they were in. They accepted responsibility. During the worst of it, they experienced a strong sense of aloneness or lack of control over events. And third, the situation forced them to confront themselves. It was this struggle with who or what I am that made these events unique and triggered intensely personal learning. Indeed, it was from hardships that leaders recognized their personal limits and developed strategies for coping with events beyond their control. The hardships, I got to keep going. The hardships as a group of developmental events are problematic. I love it that these folks did not minimize. It's problematic. The idea of deliberately manipulating failure or trauma, even for development, raises serious moral and ethical issues. We have to be really thoughtful about how we approach this. Preparing people for possible hardships or helping them cope with them is perhaps useful, but the biggest challenge may lie in helping people learn from them when they do occur. Just because an experience is painful does not mean that learning from it is automatic. It was in the stories of hardships that we saw cynicism and bitterness in many of the lessons. Like, you're not weird if you felt that. I think if you stay there, it's problematic, but it's not weird. Furthermore, hardships lose their teaching potential if people are not realistic about their responsibility for what happens. And some organizational cultures encourage denial. Or maybe don't allow us to take responsibility for our mistakes. That'd be another possibility. I mean, I'm not talking about, when I say organizational cultures, by the way, I'm talking about all of us. We got to be careful not to, we're the leaders who are responsible for this, like, you know, from managers all the way up the chain. On one hand, such learning is an intensely personal and private confrontation with self, an event that the organization has only limited right to be involved with. Isn't that interesting too? We want organizations to be responsible, but yet we also know that we have limited, like there's a limitation on the rights of the organization to be involved in our personal lives. Let's try to work that one out, that tension. On the other hand, learning from setbacks can be a cultural issue having to do with the climate of an organization fosters. When people make mistakes, they finish with this: can they admit them, learn from them, and move past them? So it's so interesting. Listen to some of the core elements of from the research. These are the personal experiences. Misjudging the importance of other people to one's success. That's what people describe. An inability to deal effectively with another party or parties, neglecting to give them or obtain information, support, or agreement. A specific discrete event with an outcome that was both clear and unsatisfactory to the person, to each of us. We failed and we were dissatisfied. And then the person admitted or accepted minor to total responsibility for the failure. That's some of the things. And then just a couple of other more deeper characteristics or elements of these failures. The leader was under additional pressures from visibility when mistakes were made. So most of the time, these are going to be very public moments. Gosh, this is why we want to support leaders, right? Like, we have to be very careful about this. The organization and the people suffered as a result of a mistake. But it also says in some cases, neither the business or the leader were harmed, but it was embarrassing. So those are some of the things. So there's some amazing things, but let me also tell you this. We did some research that was consistent with lots of other smart people who have done this kind of work. And let me tell you some of the key lessons that were learned from failure. And by the way, I'm coming back to this. It was not, speed of failure was not one of the important variables. It wasn't speed. You know what I'm saying? It was depth and the personal part of it. But listen to the lessons that emerged. Some of the lessons that came out of this, that they learned something, was this: dealing with conflict or confronting problems. They learned to do that better. They learned to direct and motivate others. Leaders learned to shoulder full responsibility. They learned to manage the hardest change. They began to understand the perspective of others better. They understand what it meant to develop other people. They learned that they must rely on others. Humility and brokenness was a key lesson. Like, just that my brokenness is something other people experience as well. But it also included lessons related to confidence, awareness, seeing yourself as a leader. And for people from a certain faith perspectives, trust in God emerged oftentimes, like a deeper trust in God. So here are my final points. That's a lot to consume. I know, there's a lot to think about in this, I know. But here's a couple of final points, just a couple of things to think about as you go into this conversation and to pull into your own, or push into your own thinking about what would it mean to create a more robust kind of internal infrastructure and infrastructure around us to put failure in perspective. Number one, failure is not something we are, but something we experience, cause, and are responsible for on some level. You know what I'm saying? It's very different to say, I am a failure. I failed. I'm responsible for it. What am I going to do about that? Number two, failure is a reality that cannot be escaped as we pursue success. It can't, it's not something to encourage, I don't think, but to create structural tolerance for. If we avoid failure, we will also avoid core parts of learning and avoid the ways we are designed to serve others around us. Number three, failure is about severity and not speed. Speed of failure had nothing to do with the research or even frequency of failure. It wasn't about that. It was just like this. These are tough personal situations. And number four, building a healthy and whole culture regarding failure, forgiveness, trust, and even grace will be necessary. And key leaders who model it. The key question being, to what extent do people in our organizations take responsibility for their failures? And I might suggest this, that one of the litmus tests for whether or not we are not in that healthy place is the extent to which blame is what we hear as opposed to taking responsibility. And if that's all we hear, then what can we do to encourage a setting where we could actually learn from these failures that we would not wish upon anybody as we go through them? So I know that's a lot to chew on, but Dr. Halleck, let's go talk.